everybody. Welcome to episode 52 of Agile Meridian's Agile Shorts. We are continuing our series on disruption. This episode is our second episode on personal disruption, which is episode 3 of our 10-part series on disruption total.
That's really complicated.
I'm sorry?
That's really complicated. Second part of 2 and the third of 10.
Yes, exactly. Well, so this is the second part of personal disruption. And it's a part of the 10-part series. Today, we're going to go through and talk about a different side of personal disruption. In the last episode, we introduced you, and Kumar talked a lot about Whitney Johnson and her book, Personal Disruption, and talked about her S-curve model and the process and the things that you can do to proactively disrupt yourself. Today's episode, we're going to talk about what happens to humans in the process of change when they're disrupted. For most of us, we're dealing with disruption when it happens to us. We're all learning the value of actually doing disruption and the value of doing it for ourselves and what it can do for moving us forward. However, most of us don't experience it that way. So today we want to really get into complementing what we talked about in the last episode with this concept of personal disruption around the areas around how you feel and how people move emotionally through this. So what I want to do is hand this over right now to Kumar as a quick review to kind of talk about where we were last time to tie it in, and then we're going to move it forward to Chris to talk about today's material.
Thank you, Mike. So last week, it wasn't a week ago, it was several weeks ago, in our first of the 2 episodes on personal disruption, we presented the Whitney Johnson S-curve model. It doesn't quite look as much as of an S as it should, but the model really is about people taking initiative and disrupting themselves, right? So if you remember from that episode, you can always go back on YouTube and watch it. People, when they join a company, they join as an inexperienced member of the new culture, the new company. And over time, they reach this sweet spot where they're engaged and they're happy and they're producing. And eventually they reach a stage of mastery. And at this point, people might start getting bored or disengaged. And at that point, and maybe even before that, people might want to start thinking about, okay, what are they going to do next? What am I going to do next to advance my career, advance my knowledge, my learning? Right? So that's a proactive approach. And what we didn't do was talk about when you are disrupted, when something comes in and takes your job from you, or you're moved to a new position, or some big personal change happens. And so we're going to be talking about that today. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Kumar. So I have to tell you, we had a pretty good debate when we were talking about these two, the last Agile Short and this one, right? We had a very good conversation, and it was a little spirited, but we were trying to get our head around what it means to be disrupted. And one of the things that I'm pretty passionate about is that, yes, I can disrupt myself, but what do you do when you wake up one day and you go into work and you find out you're out of a job? Or what do you do when you find out that you've been reassigned to another position? In my case, I have some specific experience that might be applicable, I think. So one day in August of 2020, I went to the doctor and found out that I had a heart attack. And they put me through the paces. You know, the whole time I'm thinking, it's nothing to worry about, right? I'll power through this. I've powered through everything else in my life. I'll be fine. And they ended up sending me home from the hospital with a heart attack. And they gave me this thing called a life vest. And a life vest, for those of you that don't know, is an external defibrillator. So it shocks you from the outside if you need it. And about 4 days later, I got shocked. I literally passed out. My heart went crazy. I was on the verge of not being around any longer, and the vest went off. They took me back to the hospital. And so they checked me in and they put me in. And the surgeon came around and he said, there's nothing I can do with your heart. You're going to need a heart replacement. And the insurance company and the doctors all said, but it's not bad enough. You need that, but it's not bad enough that you're going to be very high on the list to get a new heart. In the meantime, about a day later, The life vest went off again. And this time when I woke up, I woke up to nurses in my face giving me CPR, and I then ended up on a heart-lung machine, ended up getting a heart transplant. I don't remember anything from the second time I had the life vest go off until I woke up one Saturday morning and had a new heart. And as we're going through that process, my wife and I used her name's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she developed a model that takes you through the stages of grief. And while it was focused on the death, when she developed it, it was focused on the death of a close one, a close friend, a parent, a relative. What we've also found is that it tends to work for other kinds of grief. And so you go through those 5 stages. You go through denial, right? I went through it. This is nothing. I'm not having a heart attack. I'll be all right. Anger, right, is usually the next phase. And what that means is you get mad. Why did this happen to me? What did I do? Who did this to me, right? This isn't fair. I went through that. Bargaining. Hey, this will be okay. I can get through this, right? I'll power through this like I did everything else. Depression, depression is one of those things that is prevalent in our society, right? And people go through it and they struggle with, things are not going to get better. We have no hope. We're not able to find a way out, right? We think there's no way out. And then acceptance. And acceptance is where you're open to exploring new options. You're open to looking at new things. I use pardon my French, but this is when the good shit happens, right? When you get to acceptance and you're willing to be open for new things, right? New things to happen. And, in my particular case, as we were going through this, my wife and I would talk about where I was at, right? Where she was at. There were times where I would be angry, or, I've had my own company at that point. I wasn't part of Agile Meridian. I had my own company. Why did God do this to me, right? It's really starting to hit on all cylinders. What's happening here? Bargaining. I'll be okay. I can get around this. I can work around this, so we used the model to be able to talk about where I was. And by recognizing where I was and where she was, then we could start taking steps to move forward. When I was depressed, we would start talking about positive things, right? We'd start talking about the kids, our kids. We'd talk about, the positive changes that we now have to make. We talk about, going forward, the things we like. We happened right in the middle of all this. A couple days after I got the heart transplant, I had my 35th wedding anniversary. And so we celebrated in the hospital with me all hooked up to tubes. And, but we still used that as a positive to go forward. And, and I would bounce back and forth. Even after I got out of the hospital, I was telling the guys before we started the recording, at one point I even said, I've had enough of this crap. I'm done. Right. And my wife took it for exactly what it was and said, I'm taking your medicine away from you. Right. It was, you get to that point and you don't know what to do. And when we talk about, so talking about that, right, and taking you through what I did, I see this all the time in people that we work with, right? When somebody loses their job, right? They've been working in some cases, they've been working for 40 years in the same job, doing the same thing. And now some rogue guy consultant's going to come in and change the way they do things. And I think we need to recognize where we're at on this curve. And from a personal disruption standpoint, I was lucky because I did all the work to put together an embracing change class that I delivered about 6 months before I had the heart attack. So I had this framework. You can't wait until you get into the crisis to try to figure this out, right? So that's what, to me, that's what personal disruption is, right? Is personal disruption to me is not me choosing to go off and do my own thing. That's disrupting, right? I'm going to disrupt my life. I'm choosing to do that. But again, the hard part is when it happens to you, right? And it could be anything. See what you guys want to add to that.
I think it's a powerful story, Chris, and I think that people who have disruption happen to them, and in your case, it was an extreme case of disruption. It really forces you to think about what's the most important, right? How do you survive it, and how do you move forward? And I think the models can work. I mean, certainly for someone that's lost their job to someone that went through what you did, it's a completely different experience. Yes, there's denial, there's anger, there's bargaining, there's depression. All those things are present, but probably not to the degree that they were for you, right? Or would you agree? Or
Yeah, I would agree.
Similar, yeah. So I'm thinking that
from a perspective standpoint, right? When it happens to you, I don't know that you would think any differently than what I did.
Yeah, I remember back early in my career, I was fired from a job, and it was in a different industry, and I was pretty. I went through that whole thing, thinking back to my experience.
Yeah.
And it was a disruptor, right? I got out of the restaurant business because of that, and got into IT, and it changed my career, my path, my trajectory forever. Right. So it was definitely a disruption, and I think that for the person that you mentioned, right, the person that been in the company for 40 years, and they find themselves out of a job. I mean, they were probably over here in this area.
Yeah.
They were masters of their domain, maybe feeling a bit invincible or irreplaceable, and then they got disrupted.
Yeah.
I think that maybe that's where these models can play together a little bit. That.
Oh, I agree. Once I learned more about the model, about the other model,
Whitney Johnson.
Yeah, the Whitney Johnson model. Once I learned about that, I developed my own steps, right? That you go through, things you go through, and her model is very similar to the model I developed, where you go through and you have to take steps to get out of it. You just don't wake up one day and say, "Oh, I'm good to go," right? You have to do certain things and build your confidence up and understand that you're going to have bad days, right?
Yeah.
You're going to slide backwards. You're going to.
Yeah, this isn't a one-way. I would imagine in both of those curves, you think about it, the S curve for Whitney's stuff and for Kubler-Ross, you don't get to stay at a plateau and then like you camp there for the night and then continue forward. Sometimes you roll down the hill and you got to go back up again, right? So it's not like this perfect little steps up through the mountains to the peak. And it feels like from what you both have talked about, and Chris, your experiences with this, that to your point, when you're being disrupted, you're not really thinking about the severity of your disruption compared to someone else's. You're probably very almost selfishly inwardly focused on this situation happening to you, and it's intense to you because of the way that it's happening or whatever, because it is your experience. It's a very personal thing, right? But the idea that it feels like, and I want to get your guys' thoughts on this, it would be very hard to move up Whitney Johnson's curve if you weren't in acceptance, right? I don't know how you could do that in anger or in bargaining or in depression. Like you'd almost have to be, you couldn't make those moves unless you were sitting in a place of acceptance that where you could accept and actually do the work to make those moves.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you're right, Mike, not to, my experience losing that job was, for me, the worst thing that could have ever happened, right, at the time. And I can't imagine what you went through, Chris. And I don't even know if you can compare it. But yeah, to me, it was I was in denial. I was angry. I was frustrated, and I was depressed for a while, and not knowing what I was going to do with my life.
I've seen people take the steps without being open and without accepting the where they're at, and it's just somebody that's going through the steps for somebody else to
They
show.
don't get the gain, right?
Yeah, they're not effective, and their heart's not in it, right?
Yeah.
And that is a big key, right? You've got to be into it. You've got to have your heart into what you're trying to do and realize that out of change, something good is going to happen, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't believe that, right, then what's your purpose in? I'll go there. What's your purpose in living, right?
Yeah.
If you don't think things are going to get better, you may take it.
And you're right in this cycle where you're continually going around and around this grief cycle. You're back into denial. You're back getting angry at the situation that you're in, and you're depressed, and maybe you attain a certain level of acceptance, but then to your point, you may just cycle through it again and again.
Yeah. And the other thing I would just add is, when you get to this point, I'm sure you did this, Kumar, you've got to have a support system to help you. My wife, I don't think I would have got through this without my wife dragging me up. There were more days where I was depressed than when I was accepting, right? And I was moving back and forth. And she drugged me up every time I got down, right? And I have friends who called me, right? Who called me periodically just to find out how I was doing, right, Mr.
Mm-hmm.
Jebber?
Yeah.
You have, and you really, it's kind of interesting because I probably shouldn't say this, but you really find out who your friends are, right? They're your work friends that don't call you anymore because you can't help them. And then there's your friends that are there for support. And I was lucky. I've got a great support network that I didn't realize I had. And they help. And the same thing applies when you're trying to find a new job, right? Or when you get let go. You've got to have that network that is going to help you.
Yeah.
Maybe they can't get you a job, right? Maybe they can't give you the skills you need, but they're there going, hey, you're going to be all right, Kumar. You're going to get through this, right?
Yeah.
What can I do to help you?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I do help a lot of people that are going through this type of disruption as part of the coaching that we all do, right?
We see a lot of it. Yes.
We see a lot. We see this every
Yes.
time. And it's helping them work through this and accepting whatever the change that was hoisted on them or forced on them, disrupted them, and embracing it in a way,
And I think there's one more point when you think about this in terms of an organization. We were mentioning it earlier. I think, Chris, you mentioned it as we were preparing for this session. If you have an organization and say the organization, you walk in and you find out the organization was purchased and you've been doing something a certain way. And now you get this new culture and this new everything you're doing. Now you've got hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people that are all going through this together, but they're never at the same spot ever with it. They're all experiencing different spots and they have different fallback cycles and they have, different levels of just their pure nature of whether they accept change willingly as a natural part of their being versus not can play into that too. The whole kind of Rogers adoption curve element of that laid against this, that when you're doing this to help individuals, you can kind of go along and pair along with them on that path and kind of be that partner. When you're looking at it as a leader of an organization, that's a big challenge. There's a whole lot to manage there, and there's a lot of things to do. And I think part of the things we're going to talk about in the following sessions in our series around disruption, now that we've talked about personal disruption in our first episode around change, is really looking at, all right, so now we know how the humans interact to change. How change impacts people. We know how disruption can impact people. We know that people can personally disrupt themselves, and there's a pattern for that. How do you now look at this from an organizational standpoint as a leader, and how do you start to help an organization move forward, just like you would help an individual?
That's great.
Yeah, I think you've got, I think that is an area that we struggle with. And, when we go in and make changes in organizations that, I think that gets lost a lot, right? I think we have a change management function, and we're going to do this, and we're going to over communicate that and the other. But do we really get down to that personal level, right? Of, Mike is angry right now, right? And instead of Mike being angry, and us helping him, a lot of times what we do is we just say, well, he's just not going to make it.
Yeah,
right?
you get left behind, right? Exactly.
Yeah. And then you've either got to get over it and suck it up, or you leave, right? And I think as an organization, I think we need to start thinking about how we meet people where they're at, rather than just assuming everybody's going along at the same pace.
Looking forward to the next episode in this series.
Absolutely. This has been great. And thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your personal journey. It's an amazing one. It's absolutely amazing. And we're so happy to have you here with us to talk about it. I can tell you, me personally, very much so. And I want to thank everybody else for joining and sharing in this episode with us. And we look forward to continuing the conversation around disruption with you in the future episodes or in our future conversations with you. So thank you both for attending. And this has been a fantastic session.
Yes, and if you need to catch up, just go to the playlist on disruption, and you can catch the prior episodes, so you can catch up to where we are now. And we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.